Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Sunder Katwala. I'm the director of British Future. This is an event brought to you with and from the Together Coalition, of which British Future is a founding member. The report, our chance to reconnect. We're discussing the themes of that today in this webinar. What have we learned about social connection during the COVID pandemic? What happens next, and what can we do to build on it in the future? We'll hear from Jill Rutter, my colleague who led the Talk Together report research for the Together Coalition, from Danny Kruger MP, who has reported to the Prime Minister on ideas about levelling up our communities, and from Gaby Hinsliff, the commentator and journalist who takes a strong interest in these social issues. Questions and comments for the panel, put them in the chat, please, and I will relay those to the panel from you when we've heard their initial thoughts. So Jill, straight over to you to tell us about this Talk Together research about social connection and what you found.
Great. Hopefully you should all be able to see my screen. So Together is a new organisation that was founded at the end of 2019, very much in the wake of post-Brexit divisions. It's a coalition, and what brings together is its commitment to kind of social connection, to bridge some of these divides, and the desire to push social connectivity up the policy agenda. Together launched last July. It had its public launch last July, and one of the first things it did after its launch was undertake this big national conversation, which we called Talk Together. And we wanted to do this, first of all, to collect the robust evidence that we need to argue for policy change and practical action, but also to kickstart conversations in communities among organisations about social connection. So we asked everybody who took part, nearly 160,000 people, what divides us, what brings us together, and what changes are needed to bridge divides and build a more connected society. So lots and lots of people took part through an open survey, through in-depth discussions, and through nationally representative surveys as well. So what did we hear? COVID-19 last year has reminded us about the power of community. 4 times as many people think it strengthened our communities rather than divided them. We had this huge surge in volunteering. 12.4 million people volunteered last year. 4.6 million new volunteers. We had these moments of unity, clap for carers, unity around the NHS. And crucially, people have got a real appetite for more. 73% of people said that they'd like our society to be closer and more connected in future, although not everybody is certain that this is going to happen. But we're also still a divided society. COVID has divided us in new ways, and it has highlighted and accentuated existing divisions between rich and poor, between north and south, between city and town. So, kind of in summary, we're a society at a crossroads. We could harness the community spirit of last year and move forward to bridge divides, or we could go back to how we were before. And I'm interested to hear from Danny whether he senses that in government is there any sense of kind of this being a defining moment, a society at a crossroads. The community spirit of last year is a tremendous resource, but we've got some big challenges ahead. Income inequality and poverty, absolutely top of people's agenda in most parts of the UK as the division that worries people going forward. Not all our neighbourhoods have seen this upsurge of social connection. About 1 in 10 people felt that COVID-19 had made their community more divided. The Scottish independence debate is heating up, and Brexit for some people is still a live issue, although in the report we say that people's leave remain identities are now starting to fade. But Brexit is still an issue on social media. And then you've got other intergroup social identity conflicts around immigration, particularly asylum, around race and empire and free speech. And some of these conflicts could fill the gap that's been left by Brexit, by EU migration. People had a lot to say about how we do politics, the nature of our political discourse on social media, very adversarial political systems, and there was an appetite for less adversarial politics, more respectful debates on social media. Extremism is a risk. And then in the report, we argue that looking long term, there is a real risk of gradual age and place-based identity polarization. We become a society more like the United States, politically, in terms of polarized politics, in terms of where we live, that social liberals, social conservatives no longer live and work together. So gradual polarization. But it doesn't have to be that way. And there is, as I said, a real appetite for change. And people had lots and lots of ideas how we could bridge some of these divides and build a more connected society. We had literally thousands of suggestions from members of the public and experts alike. And we spent quite a lot of time grouping them into themes. Lots of people wanted to increase levels of social contact between us and them, to neighbourhood, local authority, but also at a national level. People had a lot to say about how we do politics as well. So we've drawn all these proposals together. And what we say is that we need the right foundations in place, and we need to make sure that there are facilitators of social connection in all our communities. And these foundations and facilitators enable us to form more of the bonding, bridging and linking social connections that we need to develop shared identities, shared norms of behaviour, trust, respect for our differences, and empathy and kindness. So our foundations, our work, are the workplaces where adults meet and mix with people who are different. We can design for social contact in the way that we design public space, high streets and housing. And I hope the Levelling Up Fund will reflect that. We need to meet people's income and basic needs. School education is another foundation. Schools can be community hubs. Citizenship education prepares young people for life in a democracy, and volunteering opportunities as well. So those are some of our foundations. Then our facilitators, our local and national leadership that prioritises social connection. Unifying moments, VE Day, the Jubilee next year will be a unifying national moment. The Commonwealth Games, remembrance. Another facilitator is our communication skills, digital skills, our digital inclusion, spoken and written English. And then we argue that participation is a more intensive form of social contact. So participation in activities that bring people together, sport, culture, environmental activities, conservation, faith and civil society social action. And then our last facilitator is how we do politics, voice, dialogue, civil society, civil political discourse, and more participatory forms of decision making. So at the end of the report, we came up with 10 themes, 10 areas that people want changed. And we go into those in more detail in the report, but broadly they are as set out. They're similar in many ways to some of the proposals that Danny has outlined in his report last year, and are interested to see how the government responds to Danny's report. But basically it's leadership that prioritises social connection, more respectful political debates, making sure that we can communicate with each other, re-energising citizenship education in schools, designing for social connection, involving employers in a conversation about this issue, supporting volunteering, very much in favour of volunteering passports and a single volunteering, national volunteering platform, encouraging a culture of hospitality to newcomers, and making sure that our COVID recovery plans support the civil society organisations that are involved in delivering community support, conservation, community activities in local areas. And like Danny too, we argued for a new national moment that celebrates our communities and what we have in common. But we go into that these in more detail in the report, and you can read it. So thanks very much, and that's where you can download the report.
Thank you, Jill. That report is available online, an executive summary and the full findings, which have a lot of the local and regional picture. There's a massive exercise of public conversations during the pandemic, and most people's experience was that we'd pulled together rather than pulled apart under this pressure. But the question now is, how are we going to channel and harness that? Danny, that's been your big theme as well, how we take this forward now. We'd love to hear your views about it.
Thank you very much indeed, Sunder, and thank you, Jill. And I'm very pleased to be with you all and to listen to that summary of the report. I and very much agree with everything that Jill was saying. Let me just try and frame it a bit politically, or perhaps slightly more abstractly, which is to say, for me, this is all part of the positive use of identity politics, which is coming through. And I mean, I do feel quite positive about identity politics, because for me, it's all about the politics of belonging. And we're just rediscovering the essential fact that we are related beings. We're not isolated individuals, and we don't derive fulfillment through increased autonomy and independence from each other. We derive it through the real freedom that comes from having a connection and a secure base. And I think we discovered that in the lockdown and in the pandemic as a country and personally. So there's obviously a challenge with identity politics, especially the kind of hyper politicized version, which seeks deliberately to undermine the connections in our communities, or rather to delegitimize the institutions of our country, and in a sense the inherited culture of our country. But beyond that, I regard as negative version of identity politics. We are, as I say, rediscovering each other and rediscovering the connections that we have, which are not all about being a sort of undifferentiated set of identical individuals. In fact, it is our differences that enable us to connect and to form groups, and that's okay. And I think the great opportunity of place and of local identity has been big discovery of this period, and is part of a general trend in our culture, which was underway already, which was a sense of the importance of the local and of civil society and of civic connection, and a general disquiet with the way the globalized economy and big national bureaucracies undermine people's connection with their communities. And there was that sort of disquiet in our culture and our politics already before the pandemic. I attribute the Brexit vote largely to that. I think Brexit was a response to the call of home, as I've put it, and a desire for people to have some agency, not just national sovereignty, but local sovereignty too. And that, for me, needs to be what the post-Brexit era really delivers. So I'm saying that I think we can build a politics which unites us around places. Place is not about a homogenous local culture. The good thing about places in the UK is they are generally diverse, and we have all sorts of differences within geographic communities, including cultural differences between conservatives and liberals. And how we do this, and Jill mentioned bridging and bonding capital, the way to build bridging capital is around geography, I think, and it's about enabling opportunities for people to do things together. And we've seen that tremendously in the pandemic. And many of us got involved in community activities that brought people together from different backgrounds. And being active together is the great form, is the great method of building a more united society. So, as I say, I think this is part of a positive cultural trend. I think the pandemic has exacerbated positives as well as negatives. And I completely agree with Jill's observation that we're at a crossroads, and that we could come further apart, or we could come stronger together through this. In terms of how, I very much support the 10 recommendations we just saw there. I'd add two others, which first is public service reform. I think there's the opportunity to properly sort of communitize public services, by which I mean make them more responsive to and, in a sense, owned by the communities they serve. I think we're still stuck in the Attlee model of large centralized public services accountable upwards to Whitehall, operating in silos, and the sort of so-called modernization, new public management of the last generation hasn't changed that essential structure. It's just introduced all sorts of slightly strange competitive elements into a system that remains over-centralized. So I think we need to localize our public systems and put public services much more under local control, and empower the frontline professionals, empower users, as we shouldn't really call them, I hate that phrase, but the people who rely on public services. And the other, so public service reform, which feels like it's stalled in recent years, I think we need to review and refresh the model. And then lastly is related, but more about local government. I think we need a genuine, proper rebalancing of power in this country to put neighbourhoods more meaningfully in charge of local decision making, and we need to recover the energy that we had around the big society 10 years ago when the Localism Act was passed, which is a really important bit of legislation. But we need to go much further this time and build on that. And I think that there is the opportunity now, seeing as we've really felt the power of communities and people are stepping forward, and the great shift that's happening in terms of the move from the office to a more local working life, and a general sense that we need a more sustainable local economy, I think necessitates a rebalancing of power. So I fully support all steps towards devolution within England. I think we need to go further than that, and beyond just council structures, we need to be innovative in the way we develop models of participatory democracy and community engagement that give people that sense of agency, which I think is at the root of our discontents, that people feel essentially disempowered by the structures of the system. So we need to reform our model of government and be much more innovative. And there's a huge opportunity through digital to do that well. So I endorse the points about facilitators locally. I think there's a big theme around social infrastructure, and as I say, a big transfer of power to communities. Feels like those feel like the agendas for our time. Back to you, Sunder.
Thank you, Danny. Gaby, over to you. How do we use this moment? How do people see this moment?
Thanks very much, Danny and Jill. I don't know about you, but over the last year, I've really missed people, specific people, obviously, but also people generally. So I completely agree. There's going to be a hunger for human contact and for building on the togetherness we felt early in the pandemic after this. But I do worry that, as with the banking crash 2008, the recovery for the pandemic could be more divisive than the emergency itself, as some people find themselves back on their feet very quickly and other people don't. I think there's a risk of seeing togetherness as a sort of way of papering over the cracks a bit with sort of warm, fuzzy feelings. And I think Danny mentioned the sort of emergence of strongly identity-based mass movements, Brexit, Scottish independence, Black Lives Matter, even the upswell of female anger we've seen lately with Me Too and after the Sarah Everard murder this week. And on the one hand, those movements, I think, bring together people who wouldn't always have met, and they do create a powerful sense of belonging and solidarity within the group. So every woman I know has been talking about Sarah Everard this week, and so have a heartening number of men, actually. And anything that brings the Duchess of Cambridge and radical feminist campaigners to the same vigil, I think, is probably capable of having a unifying effect. And similarly, I think absolutely healthy and necessary to have, but those conversations can be polarizing, they can get angry, so they need to be actively led by government in the national interest, not as a means of sort of scoring cheap points. It's the difference between having a screaming row with your other half which ends in you wanting a divorce and having a constructed conversation mediated by a marriage guidance counsellor which ends up with you trying to find a way forward that's constructive. So the conclusions here are very sound, but everything now relies on formulating a government and civic strategy for whom this isn't just sort of warm words. We all remember David Cameron's Big Society. Danny worked on it, and I think in his report I see a few familiar ghosts resurfacing, which was a lovely idea that died a slightly sad death, partly because, and Danny may disagree with me, it never quite boiled down to tangible policy, and partly because it was an agenda that felt made for sort of calm, prosperous times, not for a recession and public spending cuts. And that's the spectre here. You know, Whitehall departments have massive mountains to climb post-COVID. They will focus on stuff they have to deliver, where there's legislative obligation or targets set by number 10 or sort of a massive public outcry, and stuff they have a budget for. I've seen so many terrific ideas kind of perish for lack of those things. And I'd be interested to hear what the next tangible steps on this stuff within government is. My final point would be that togetherness advocates in some ways need to practice what they preach and join themselves up, because there's a lot of crossover, similar ideas from people coming from different areas that you feel could converge. And just this morning, I was listening to Rachel D'Souza, the Children's Commissioner, talking on the radio about her plans to get children back on track, not just at school, which in a way is the easy bit, but socially they've lost a year of social skills, and actually grassroots sports probably as important there as maths. And immediately you can see connections with some of the recommendations in this report and some of Danny's ideas about grassroots community recovery. And the former sports minister, Tracy Crouch, has talked about the need for a sort of cross-cutting Whitehall Department of Wellbeing. I'd sort of almost call it a department for recovery, because what you're looking at is you know, this need to get back from where we were, recover from the sort of, you know, impacts of COVID and come back to a point where we're building back better is the sort of, you know, the phrase that keeps getting used. It's a terrible cliche, but we do need to start putting the pieces back together. And if we can have an entire department for Brexit, I think we can probably have a department for putting things back together. So thank you very much. I won't take up any more of your time. Thanks.
Danny, it'd be good to hear you come back there. I mean, some challenges there. Bonding can link, but it can be polarizing, but togetherness can sometimes duck some of those divides. But this issue of how much direction, too little direction, and we don't channel this, and too much direction, and you've got the top-down state that you don't want. How are we going to get the balance right in this particular new context and these new pressures, do you feel?
Well, there is that tension, but I think, you know, we've led too much towards centralization in recent decades, and we need to lean the other way now. So I would say the emphasis should be on local freedom and on enabling communities to take their own way. And you know, some of my colleagues have anxieties about that, and they might remember loony left councils, or they might think you can't trust local government. I think that's no longer right, and we should be more trusting. And as I've said, I think we should go beyond councils anyway and trust communities directly. But it is also true to say that not everywhere has the social capital, the institutions, the skills that will benefit from those freedoms, particularly if we're talking about opening up funding opportunities that you need, established local players to make use of. And we have seen that, unfortunately, in recent years, when attempts to empower communities simply reinforce existing inequalities. So there needs to be a very deliberate strategy around that, and that's where I think this role of facilitators and of deliberately investing in the social infrastructure of places, and being very patient about how long it takes for a place to develop its strategy and to bring the people together that will lead it, is really important. We can't work on these short time cycles. So I think it is possible. I mean, and the last thing I'd say is, I'm a conservative and I believe very strongly in the need for an overarching national culture that unifies and that is, in a sense, preached. And I worry about a sort of neutral state that doesn't really have an opinion about the way communities should work and what matters. So while I believe in trust in communities, I also think we need leadership, and there's a role for kind of cultural figures in that. It's not just about politicians, but we need a sense of ourselves as a country in order for local places to have for the autonomy of local places to be safe and sustaining. Let me quickly come back on the big society if I can, because I actually share a lot of the disappointment with that agenda. I think it was the right idea, and it remains I think the defining idea of our century, which is that we need to move away from a bureaucratized, centralized model, and also move away from a market-only model as well. This is genuinely. Blair was talking about the third way. He was right. There is a different alternative to these extremes of the market and state, and the big society was an attempt to put that into practice. But yes, the timing was terrible. I don't think they went far enough, and ultimately it wasn't transformative, and it did feel, and often I think probably was in some ways, an attempt to sort of offset what was happening in the economy and in public finances. So we've got to do it better this time, bigger and better. But it remains the right idea, and a lot of those themes around empowerment and public service reform and volunteering and the role of business as a social actor, those are all the right ideas for now as well.
Good to hear, Jill, your thoughts on this. I mean, siloing is obviously a challenge for government and national government. It can be a challenge for local government. It can be a challenge for civil society too. As Gaby was saying, there's these different agendas that could link up, difficult to link up. How can we get past that kind of siloing, do you think?
I mean, it's through kind of coalitions like Together. I mean, the real challenge is to kind of make social connection, social contact a salient political issue. At the moment, it's something that kind of everyone agrees is a good thing, but nobody sort of pushes up the agenda. I think having somebody in the cabinet with responsibility for social connection, I think kind of looking at cabinet office responsibilities as well. But it's also up to civil society to kind of break down some of the silos between the sort of well-being movement, the integration movement, the peace building and conflict resolution, and community development. We've got all these silos, and I think leadership at a local authority level is needed there. But we all have to try and make the links and break down those silos.
Thanks. Just looking at some of the early questions that are coming in, and people can put them in the Q&A if you'd like to ask them. Manoj, Joshi would like to know about the role of faith communities and institutions, which I know is something the Together Coalition has looked at. Danny, it's something you had things to say about as well, and also asks how do we mitigate the potential impact of international events on community cohesion and harmony. And there are some related questions about different types of community relations. Nicholas Hatton, who is part of the 3 million EU citizens, says, how do we define the we when we talk about society? That EU nationals call the UK their home, but then there are barriers in access to citizenship. So if if we want inclusive identity, should we be doing more to invite immigrants to join the we and to be celebrated in doing so, and reflect that in practical measures like citizenship and application fees? So a question there about migrant groups, EU nationals, but also about the role of faith communities generally. Jill, can I start with you on that?
I think I'll pass on that for a moment.
Go to Danny. Danny, the role of faith communities is a big theme for you. What is there a new energy there?
Well, there's enormous energy there and amazing potential, and I think yes. So what I proposed is a new deal, as I call it, faith communities who have immense resources of expertise, manpower, physical assets. I mean, the Church of England is a whopping great building in every community, poorest places in the country, and they have deep connections and relationships, and they're in it for the long term. So they're just what we need, frankly. And so I think that faith communities should be saying to government, we want to be at the table and involved in the discussions and the design and delivery of services and sort of placemaking, as appropriate, depending on the subject, and obviously with the consent of local people and local government. But so I think that we don't need to be giving them lots more money. We just need to be sending a signal to, particularly to local public servants and local government, that faith communities have a role and should be involved and invited in, and could take quite a lot of the burden. There are amazing projects like Christians Against Poverty who just do incredible work on debt. There's Homes for Good who help families stay together with children on the edge of care, help them avoid having children going into care, ex-offender work with the homeless. But all of this is quite disjointed, and often, frankly, to be blunt, can be not very good. And little operations working independently according to their own lights isn't necessarily the right thing to be happening. So we need to harness this energy and channel it, and I hesitate to say regulate it, but to sort of make it part of the mainstream without, again, going back to our earlier conversation, without killing without destroying the value of it, which is in a sense its independence. So this is not an easy, straightforward process, but at the moment, faith and government are too far apart. And then on integration and welcome, I really think that's a vital point, and I like the point in the recommendations around welcome for people arriving in new places. That applies to people coming to this country as well, and I think we need a much more deliberate attempt to demonstrate inclusion and welcome. And the arrival of what might be millions of Hong Kongers over the coming years under the government scheme is an opportunity to really get that right. And I've been involved in discussions there. And again, the faith community has a big role to play in organising and settling immigrants. And the community sponsorship scheme, which has been trialled under this government, inspired by the Canadian model to help refugees settle, I think could be applied much more widely, not just to refugees, to immigrants who are arriving here without knowing people, without having social connections. It's not just they need the local authority to tell them where the job centre is. They need the engaged welcome of a community, and that's the role for civil society. So I think there is a lot we could get right, but government. There's
roles of faith and civil society there. Just another theme that a couple of people are asking about. Danny, it'd be good to hear your thoughts on this. The role of business here. Business has a key role in local communities throughout the UK. What more could they be doing now as we emerge from the pandemic? And a linked question that Andrew Dixon has asked is saying we're talking a lot now about town centres and the transition they need to go through, and there's a lot of policy focus, maybe some funding attached to that, but that's often physical infrastructure, economic activity. And are we thinking enough about linking that to social infrastructure, shared spaces, community run ventures? How can we link up those areas of thinking about policy?
Well, there is a big theme around business and about the social economy and the role of business in communities. And I think we have a big opportunity to get that right with the evidence we've seen from the pandemic that actually social enterprises are particularly resilient or particularly good at the sort of growth that we need at this time, more inclusive growth. These are the enterprises that thrive in the poorest neighborhoods. And there's a role particularly, I think, for bigger firms to support the local sort of ecology of enterprise and SMEs. So I think there's a whole new narrative emerging around purpose-led business and about the social responsibilities of business, which go beyond CSR. So, and I'm hoping that COP might be, the Climate Change Summit might be an opportunity to, again, present businesses in their true character, which is, as they serve the public. They don't exist for private profit. That's not why they have legal protections, and they have a social purpose first and foremost. And the more we can express that, the better. And in terms of place in towns, social infrastructure, I couldn't agree more. That's the theme of my report. Levelling up isn't just going to happen because we roll out broadband and connect the train network more successfully. We've got to invest in the institutions which make places livable, give them identity, create opportunities for people. There's a business role there too. The modern library should really be a centre for local SMEs and startups and digital skills and access to support for entrepreneurs, as well as doing all the wonderful things that libraries can do. So I think we can create social infrastructure that can support a thriving local business economy as well. But yes, that theme is vital, and it is recognised in government. And DCMS are very, very strong on this, as are BEIS, Cabinet Office. There's a lot of conversation going on around social infrastructure and how to support levelling up through that lens.
Gaby, I'll bring you in if you've heard some of that about place and also the role of business perhaps in local connection.
Yes, I'm sorry, I may be only responding to half of what I've heard here because I lost you at some point there. Better rural broadband, that's my chief recommendation for this report. Thank you very much. But I think, Danny's right. There's a sort of, there's a very clear sort of infrastructure agenda, which we've heard a great deal about connecting up north and south or connecting different towns. But it's not just a question of bringing things together physically. It's a question of having something, reasons to feel rooted or feel that you belong in a specific community. And I think we're also, when we talk in general terms about how people have come through the last year and whether or not people will feel more connected as a result, there's a tendency to generalize and say people feel, communities feel they've been brought together by this. Well, some communities feel they've been brought together by this in the same way that some families have been brought together by the experience of being stuck in the house together for a year, and some families have been driven absolutely nuts by the experience of being in the same house for a year. If you were a strong, vibrant, healthy community before, then you probably have leaned on each other throughout the crisis and you probably have felt it brought you together. If you were a community that was struggling before and that had a lot of problems before, and that and we know that COVID has touched some communities more than others, we know that COVID rates have been higher in deprived communities. If you were a community that was struggling to start with, a crisis can push you apart. So there's a need not to sort of generalize about what a community is and what the impact of COVID on a community has been. Thanks.
Jill, did you want to say something about this shared spaces agenda that has come up and how to link that up?
We can design for social connection, and we can involve people in the planning system, in designing, in the new design codes for new housing developments, and we can involve communities in providing new housing through community land trusts. And doing Talk Together, we met some fantastic projects in different parts of the UK, in the northeast, where involvement in some of the towns where involvement in local communities has been quite low. We saw some fantastic examples of community land trusts in Redcar, in Middlesbrough, regenerating some of the housing in parts of the town that were rather run down, and it was great to see that work supported in the recent budget. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in this public space planning design area to involve people, to involve whole communities, and actually design our housing and high streets for social connection.
Thanks. Another theme being asked about, Harry Hobson would like to know, what's the right role for technology and big tech here? Is that in supporting local groups? Is it closing the digital exclusion gap? Is it data to power local decision making? Danny, what should we prioritize in having an ask from technology?
Well, I'm smiling because Harry and I are working on exactly that agenda together, and he knows what I think, which is yes, there's an enormous role for data and digital in connecting our societies and in empowering communities. So we have a big problem with digital take up in civil society. It's the great laggard sector. I'm proud to say the majority of charities particularly regard themselves as behind the curve on digital use and of course on data collection, which is a massive inhibitor to the sort of reforms that are needed, and the public service opportunity I mentioned, which is to pass power and responsibility out from the central state. So we've got to fix that, and we can also, I think, we should rise as a nation to the massive digital exclusion challenge. We have 9 million people not online, or not able to use the internet confidently, and of course many of them don't want to, and that's completely fine. But of course, it is the people in most disadvantage who are most behind. So we can and should be working with the big tech firms and with governments to overcome that. And lastly, as Harry knows, the opportunity to make use of community data more effectively is pretty tremendous. Lots of questions around use and ownership of data, but I think we can genuinely enhance the way we make decisions and engage people much more successfully through these deliberative online engagement methods if we grab that agenda.
Jill, what did you discover about digital exclusion in this process?
That as well as people who are not online at all, you've got about 20% of people who are limited internet users. They've got dodgy connections, they share devices, they haven't got all the skills that they need. So they need to be kind of pushed up the ladder a bit. And I think the other thing that we discovered is that digital exclusion, particularly around slow broadband, really plays into kind of narratives about kind of Westminster not caring about the rest of the country, north-south divides in Wales, rural urban divides, people who have got slow broadband and perhaps poor public transport think that central government doesn't care about them. So it's about public trust, it's about political trust as well.
Gaby, do you want to come in on that?
I lost you again there, I'm afraid, in the middle. I froze. I'm sorry. I'm probably not the best person to come to on that because I only heard half of it. You may need to go to one of the others, I'm afraid, at that point.
We'll go on. Sam Coates has this to say. Security and safety are a basic foundation for place-based community. How do people see that? He says central social justice has found that in a sort of hierarchy of needs, crime security is very basic, and the Everard tragedy, he says, has surely reinforced that sense that is absolutely foundational. Danny, does that affect your thinking about these issues?
I'm so sorry, Sunder, I cut out. I couldn't hear you for the second half of that. Apologies, I could see you, but go on, say it again.
This is about security and safety as a very basic foundation place-based community, and the Sarah Everard tragedy has reinforced that.
Yes. So, community, it goes back to the inequality question. I mean, communities where there is, strong civil society and social connections are inherently safer. I mean, to what extent that plays into this question about women's safety at night and in the streets. There's a huge policy agenda there, which is obviously very live right now. But I think we have there's a broader discussion around the context in which young people are growing up, the expectations they have of each other, sexual equality, and issues around gender, which fundamentally do require the right conversations to be had locally. And yes, we have to get our culture right at a national level, and there's stuff that can be done through education and from above. But really, we need stronger families and stronger communities to bring people up and bring boys up well. And to me, this debate around the abuse that women suffer and how incredibly widespread that is just really reinforces the need for positive cultural norms to be disseminated through our communities and in our families. And that's a generational job that, yes, government has a big role in, and we certainly have to get policing policy right, which we're debating at the moment in Parliament. But these are cultural questions, and stronger families, stronger communities in very traditional ways, I think, are needed to remind boys of what is expected of them.
Gaby?
I think in a sense they're separate issues, really, aren't they? I mean, I'm glad to hear Danny say all of that, and I couldn't agree more strongly. But I think that's a policing challenge, that's a cultural challenge, that's a gender challenge. It's not necessarily immediately part of the agenda we're talking about, which is sort of togetherness in a post-COVID era. I do think I would go back to what I said at the beginning, which is togetherness doesn't have to mean that we have to brush difficult conversations under the carpet, or that all differences are sort of buried under a sort of smothering blanket of we're all going to be nice to each other now. It doesn't mean that you have to bury awkward conversations. And it doesn't mean as well, I think sometimes this is fear, and particularly that's true of identity-based movements, that calls for togetherness or calls for sort of national unity are a way of papering over the difficult stuff and pretending that we're all in this together. We're all in this together became quite a divisive phase, almost ironic as that sounds, during the pandemic, because people in some ways responding quite angrily to that. You got people saying, well, actually, we're not all in it together, because it's a very different experience of the pandemic if you're living in a sort of, a lovely house with a garden and you can easily work from home, than if you're at the top of a tower block with 3 small children under 8 and you just lost your job and you're broke. So we're not all in it together. And we have to be able to balance those two things, those ideas that national solidarity, national unity and national togetherness can't be allowed to sort of brush over the ways in which we remain divided and we remain unequal. And I think it's balancing those two concepts, that yes, we can be together, but within that sort of blanket of togetherness, you have different competing interests and different competing injustices. That's the key to making this feel that it's not it's not merely a warm words agenda, that it is an agenda that changes people's lives.
Jill?
Sam is completely right. I mean, security and safety underpin kind of communities where kind of people connect, where people don't feel secure in terms of their livelihoods, in terms of their personal safety, they don't connect. We are concerned about some of the neighbourhoods that are either very divided or very disconnected. And in the report, we say that around 1 in 8 neighbourhoods experience significant levels of disconnection or division, or sometimes both. And there's lots of things that can turn this around. Obviously, policing is essential. Community leadership is essential. But I think we also need to give the people that live in those communities, particularly young people, a stronger sense of a stronger stake in society. You don't get involved in kind of low-level antisocial behaviour if you feel a very strong stake in your own community. So it's kind of it's the youth projects, it's youth sport, it's social action that gives young people a sense of a stake in their own communities that I think is really important here and can turn things around.
Thanks very much. And Danny, I know you're limited in the time you've got with us today, so it would be interesting to hear from you in terms of all these challenges where there's a lot of energy to harness. What's going to make the most difference now in the next sort of 3 months, next 6 months for people outside government? What can actually make a difference to how this agenda goes forward?
Thank you very much. Well, so politically, we've got local elections coming up, and it'd be very interesting to see how we have conversations around those in terms of the sorts of policies that we want local government to follow. And I mean, in Wiltshire, where I'm an MP, there's the Wiltshire Council was very much on this agenda before the pandemic, in the sense that they, as many councils do, responding to local government cuts. You can either, cut your services, or you can pass them to communities, and that's what good councils have done all over the country, Labour and Conservative ones. They've diversified and empowered residents and frontline staff to do more and rely less on the power of the town hall. So I think there is the opportunity to build on that. Obviously, we really do need to reinvest in local government. I'm not suggesting that austerity is a good thing. I really regret many of the cuts that have happened, but those sorts of innovations, which were happening anyway before the pandemic, have in a sense been accentuated by it, because town halls have had to rely on communities much more, which is a good thing. And I think the answer to your question is we all just need to be stepping up in so much as we can, and getting more political with a small p, performing the functions of a citizen, which is to be an active member of the local or the national polis. That's what citizenship should be about. And there are increasing opportunities I've mentioned around digital innovations for that. I mean, just the simple fact that town and local council meetings have gone online in this pandemic, and government's just extended that for a bit. I hope that remains, because we've seen many more people get involved as participants, or at least spectators, in local government through that. We need to increase those sorts of innovations. And as I say, I just think stepping forward, and the evolution from the mutual aid group, which was really a kind of crisis response service to people who were isolating and needed their shopping delivered, which we all saw in a most amazing way. The further evolution of that is a more organised, sustained, frankly more challenging set of tasks that communities need to perform for each other around supporting families in ongoing crisis and difficulty, and the fallout from the pandemic and the lockdown is going to be very complex and difficult. So it's not as simple as dropping shopping off on the front doorstep, but we do still need those mutual aid groups. And our one in Devizes, where I'm the MP, is just relaunched as a new project, new charity called Love Devizes. It was just the mutual aid group for COVID. It's now going to be supporting communities in the area forever, I hope. So we need to sustain that spirit deliberately, and I obviously put in all my recommendations for government on that, and they're all being considered. So, but ultimately, this is about a bottom-up revolution, people taking action, taking responsibility. That's what we need to continue to do.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks very much for joining us today. Jill and Gaby, if I could bring you in on this as well, just some thoughts that people are having, just a bit of challenge here to togetherness. And Gaby, I think this builds on the theme that you've been having. Lydia Harper says, Danny mentioned a central and unified vision of what community means, but who decides that? How will that not create a standard of Britishness that can exclude and exacerbate existing inequalities, alienate communities, leave behind existing work? We've seen that in migration policy, and a couple of other participants have also had similar challenges there. Jill, you mentioned VE Day at the start, and one or two people have said, are these rather jingoistic ideas that have been said to be the moments of togetherness, or how will they play in the Celtic nations is another question that's come up. So there's a set of similar challenges there that if you try and have a common life, you're going to exclude. A related question or challenge about what to do about that, Neil Denton says this, fully behind the idea of local facilitators, he says, because it can create bridging capital and that builds resilience. But positive contact, harnessing energy and disagreement takes a lot of skill. And it takes a lot of support. Have we thought about the skilling and supporting that needs to be provided if we're looking for that kind of facilitation of conflict? Jill, can I ask you to share your thoughts on those challenges and questions? You're muted, Jill.
About kind of national moments. I mean, I gave the example of VE Day. Participation in the VE Day celebrations over last summer was very, very high. It brought together different generations, perhaps more so in the pandemic than before. But these national moments are what you make it yourselves, and are your own interpretation. I mean, on Remembrance Day, you can wear a white poppy. So it's not about a kind of homogenized version of culture. It's about taking part. It's about debating these differences of interpretation in a respectful way. And our political differences are kind of a factor of our kind of rich democratic tradition. In terms of dialogue, I really do think we need to invest more money, a little more money in projects that bring people together where our communities are very divided. Lots of examples of this going on. The Tim Parry and Jonathan Ball Peace Foundation in the Northwest is doing a lot of very exciting work in communities that are experiencing stress and divisions. I think we need a bit more investment in that. In Scotland, I think there needs to be more civil society space to debate independence or not, and the type of society that Scotland aspires to be. We saw a few projects, a few initiatives in 2014, and I think there's a real need for more civic society space now to debate these differences. So that's my response there.
And Gaby.
Yeah, I think it's interesting whenever we talk about unifying moments. I mean, it is a simplification. It's a necessary simplification of a complicated subject, because there's no such thing as a moment or an event or an issue on which sort of 70 million people are ever going to be all entirely agreed. And when we think about, unifying moments in British history where it has felt as if, there's a kind of unity of national purpose, there was always going to have been someone who felt excluded by that, or who did not feel part of that, or felt as, when you go back to, everyone always talks about the Olympics in this context, but you go back to that sort of, I don't think anyone's told the sort of national story better in recent years than the Olympic opening ceremony. But even to mention the idea of a national story now offends a lot of people, or invites immediate questions about which story you're telling, even though the whole point of that ceremony was that it tried to tell as many stories as possible simultaneously, and as many aspects and facets of Britishness as it could possibly sort of cram into one ceremony. So I think we have to accept that there's no such thing as an entirely as a moment or a sort of unifying sentiment that absolutely everyone can agree with. But it's true that there are some moments in public life which drive people into instant raging disagreement, and there are some that do bring people together. And in the act of bringing people together, you have to recognize that it's all right sometimes for some people to be at odds with that. It's all right sometimes for people to disagree with that. It's all right for some people to feel that they don't belong to whatever it is that you're specifically, we're not turning against those who don't feel included by, or don't feel represented by, whatever it is that you're trying to sort of include them in. So it's balancing those two things, the idea of unity with the idea that doesn't have to mean conformity, that there doesn't have to be only one version of events, and if you don't agree with this, then somehow you're offside.
Yeah, and there's no doubt at all, I think, that things like flags, anthems, symbols, poppies, they have different meanings depending on what you say their meanings are. I think the the stories of the world wars, for example, are also the story of empire and Commonwealth and decolonization. If you know that, and if you don't know that, then you haven't got the full story. And so there's bridging potential there to write everybody's stories in, and then you have a debate about whether that contextualization is, offending people or something they need to know. But we've seen, I think, opportunities to do that with some of the symbols of history and identity, and they can be polarizing and divisive, but that can be educational. There's a very broad take up of the broad version of that, but it's news to some people, and some people have been waiting for those stories to be told. But there'll be other issues, as you say, that are more polarizing and divisive. Another question we have from Julian Wathan: how can we perform the functions of a citizen? Danny asked us to do that when education glosses over this key subject. Jill, you mentioned bring back citizenship education, or revive it or revitalize it. What's missing?
A commitment to do it in schools. In 2001, my job, I worked in a university, was to set up and run a PGCE course in citizenship education for this new subject, which was brought in by David Blunkett into English schools in 2002. It was a compulsory subject in all secondary schools in 2002, but academy schools in England have now the ability to opt out of citizenship education, and many do, or they merge it into this subject called personal health and social education. So it's kind of sex and drugs and a bit of politics, if you're lucky. We were told in all parts of the UK that schools and education needs to play a much greater role in preparing young people to be involved in politics and for their life in a future democracy. And basically what we heard was there's a need to make sure that schools themselves are community hubs. They are part of the community. They should be sharing some of their facilities, like performance space and playing fields. But the curriculum, the citizenship curriculum, was very, very important as well. And what we argued in the report is that we need to revive the subject, put more energy into it, into modern studies in Scotland, and that all children in the course of their career should have volunteering opportunities, that they should have opportunities to meet people from different backgrounds, and that they should learn about how to take part in politics and positive political debate on social media. So reviving the citizenship education programme of study in schools was one of our recommendations, and the Together Coalition does want to take forward some of this work going forward.
Gaby.
Yeah, I will just push back very gently, I think, on the idea that, I mean, I'm all in favour of citizenship education in schools. I'm a little bit wary of the fact that often our prescribed solution to things is for kids to be taught it in school. If someone added up once a list of all the things that people had said that children should be taught in school, it was like, literally, we no time for anything else. Forget maths, forget history, forget geography. Literally, all you would be learning is life skills from about 8 in the morning to 7 in the evening. But I think also there's a tendency sometimes to diagnose in children the problems that actually we have as adults, because I think that kids, I mean, teenagers are brilliant in participating in politics. You know, they do nothing but argue about things. It's a hugely activist generation now. You know, they are fascinated by environmental politics. They're fascinated by social justice. They're fascinated by and marching on and involved in and protesting about all. quite lackluster sometimes about community participation. And sometimes you have a very activist generation of kids. They may not want to get involved, may not want to sit on their parish council, but they're in the age spectrum. It tends to be older people, it's the over 50s who volunteer most, who
we seem to have lost Gaby.
I think we lost Gaby there. Jill, let me ask you a specific question about the Together Coalition from Nick Harborne. He says, as a small local charity, they won't have the time and resources to engage with many similar charities. You might have Citizens UK, British Future, Redeem Our Communities, Hope Not Hate, City Sanctuary, all seeking national conversations, national sector umbrella bodies, CVSs having local conversations. Might there be too many such organisations? Might they compete with each other and dilute the resources? So what differentiates Talk Together and the Talk Together Coalition? Could you say something about that?
I mean, it's a very broad coalition, and it's really important. I mean, it's most important that people like Nick are active in their local community, but it's about sort of keeping in touch and trying to raise the salience of social connection locally and nationally. I mean, kind of writing to your local MP, telling him or her what you're doing and why this issue is important is probably the most important thing that smaller organisations like the one that Nick represents can do going forward, because we really do need to push social connectedness up the agenda.
And the Together Coalition, I think, is literally trying to answer Nick's challenge, because it is trying to bring together lots of those groups and try and coalesce the people who are working on, narrative change or policy change or participation, and bring lots of groups together. So it is a coalition that everybody is invited to join, that hopefully can signpost people around other groups with more specialist specialist interests. And Gaby, thanks for coming back on there. We've got lots of other questions, but we might not quite get to all of them. Sorry if we don't get to your questions, and the hashtag Talk Together can be used to take this forward, and we can keep talking about this. I mean, people are asking questions about specific policy areas, social care and mental health services that could be very important places to pioneer some of the agenda we've been talking about participation and volunteering. Just an interesting sort of final thoughts from both of you would be good. But a lot of people are a bit pessimistic about this happy thought that we might keep the surge going, and would say, well, that was for its moment, wasn't it? You clapped for the NHS, you volunteered in your communities, lots of people were furloughed. You'd expect to have had a surge, and you'd expect to lose it. And of course, there's some sociological reality to that, but it's rather fatalistic, or is it realistic? What are we hoping to do, and in which areas, and what can we hope to build on and take forward, and what should we see as being of its moment? That might be an interesting point to end on, as well as your final thoughts. Gaby, can I come to you first on that broad theme?
Yeah, I mean, of course, people responded to their circumstances in the pandemic. That's totally right. It was a very unusual, extraordinary moment in time, and people responded to that. And as their lives get back to normal, and as their lives fill up again with other things, once everyone's back to work and back into the swing of normal life or whatever, then there's a very, don't underestimate the power of inertia, that we just bounce back to where we were and nothing much changes. And, all the column sort of inches that have been filled over the last year with people saying, we will never be the same again. Actually, we often are. And that's the lesson of sort of, big events in history for the last God knows however long. Every time something cataclysmic happens within society, people say, well, this will change everything. And it doesn't quite change everything. But, policy has a huge role to play in driving what we do going forward. If government stays out of the picture and everyone else stays out of the picture, then we will just slide back into our old habits. But this is a moment where you have choices to make, and where you can instill different habits in people, and where you can create different structures that do change the way we behave going forwards. And I think some of the things that we think now as as unifying national institutions, you know, the BBC or the NHS or the ones that people always come up with, or the welfare state, you know, they didn't just sort of magically sort of drop on us from the heavens. They were brought about by political interventions. And it's finding something of that magnitude of difference that's interesting now. I mean, the one thing I noticed at the end of Danny Kruger's report, you know, he comes up with his recommendations and they cost billions. And
we've lost.
I think Gaby was about to fund the recommendation, so it would be important to know. We'll find out later what that was. But Jill, how do we, what do we realistically do to build on this when it will be different in future?
I mean, we have huge challenges going forward. We can't gloss over that. I mean, the economy, the impact of any downturn on certain groups in society, we simply can't gloss over that at all. But I think there are some areas of hope. Huge numbers of new volunteers last year for food banks, shopping for their neighbours, for the NHS. And although people's time may be limited as they go back to work, we found that a lot of people do want to continue volunteering. So having a varied offer where people can volunteer once every 3 months when is convenient, making it easy to volunteer is really important. But I think some other changes last year, which are, I think, point to some broader societal shifts, are the value that we attach to key workers, people who perhaps haven't been appreciated in the past, our delivery drivers, our supermarket workers, who kept the country going alongside the NHS. I think there are kind of changing debates about the value that we attach to medium and low skilled workers. Then I think appreciation of non-material things and these stronger local links point to some societal shifts. And it's how we kind of harness those and how we respond in future are difficult to predict. But as we said in the report, we're a society at a crossroads. And if we want to take a path to a more connected society, government certainly needs to lead and to act, and so do our institutions, but we've all got a role to play. And I think what our concluding remark in the Talk Together report was that we all need to play a part if we're going to go down a road to a more connected society.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks, Jill and Gaby, Danny earlier for joining us. Thanks to you for tuning in and joining us. Together.org UK is the website of the Together Coalition. You can read more about the Talk Together research, what it said about the issues and the areas that you're involved with, but you can also find out how you can engage in its future activities. There'll be the National Day of Reflection called by Marie Curie for March the 23rd, which the Together Coalition and many of its members will be supporting. And then there are other activities going forward. So it's a coalition that everybody is invited to join if they're part of this movement to build a kinder, more connected society. Thanks very much for helping us start the conversation this lunchtime, and we do hope you'll stay in touch with us. Thanks again for our speakers and participants.